women on the jury. And what they didn't get to hear, would it have changed the outcome?
What's the most important piece of evidence you think they didn't hear?
Tonight, your most complete look yet at how it all came together.
Every child's worst nightmare to be followed on the way home in the dark.
This is the path where the lives of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman collided that night.
The neighborhood watchdog on a collision course with a kid in a hoodie, Trayvon Martin.
And he said, "You're gonna die tonight."
With today's verdict, is a racial powder keg about to explode?
We are not racist!
Here's David Muir.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of 2020. And tonight, the breaking news here, not guilty. More than 15 hours after they got the case, 6 women came out of that jury room within the last hour and handed in their verdict. In essence, delivering the future of George Zimmerman. Just moments ago, Trayvon Martin's father tweeting this, and we'll put it up on the screen right now. God blessed me and Sabrina with Trey, and even in his death, I know my baby is proud of the fight we, along with all of you, put up for him. God bless. A family in pain tonight, while another family, the family of George Zimmerman, inside that courtroom with tears, hugging his defense team. ABC's Matt Gutman has been on this case in Florida ever since the story first broke, and he joins us live outside the courthouse in Sanford. Matt, good evening.
Good evening, David. In fact, this caps 17 months of suspense. That's after George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin on that cold February night. Now those 6 jurors, 5 of them mothers, coming to this verdict. Now, let's just pause for a second to hear Judge Deborah Nelson read out that verdict.
In the Circuit Court of the 18th Judicial Circuit in and for Seminole County, Florida, State of Florida versus George Zimmerman. Verdict: we, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty. So say we all foreperson.
Does either side want to poll the jury?
We would, Your Honor.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as your juror number is being called, please answer whether this is your verdict.
Juror B29, is this your verdict? Yes. Juror B76, is this your verdict? Yes. Juror B37, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror B51, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror E6, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Juror E40, is this your verdict?
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, just after that moment, David, the judge said that Zimmerman's business in court is over. She released him from his bond. He had his GPS ankle bracelet cut off, and soon after that, he was whisked away. His defense team says to a safe location. They also say that George Zimmerman will probably live at least the next few years, possibly the rest of his entire life, in hiding. But whatever happens, that 5-minute interaction between George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin will probably tie those 2 people and their 2 names eternally together. David.
Matt Gutman outside the courthouse for us here. Matt, thank you. And so much of this trial being watched closely by the people of Sanford, Florida, and across this country. Let's go to ABC's Gio Benitez right now. Reaction from the community to the verdict. Gio's been reporting on this case for some time as a Florida-based reporter. Gio, what are they saying outside the courthouse?
Well, David, good evening to you. There are still people here, many who support the state, who wanted to see George Zimmerman convicted. Some were out here earlier today who also supported George Zimmerman, but those were outnumbered, of course, by the Trayvon Martin supporters. And one of those is Melinda, a mother of 3. Why did you bring your children out here? You told me it's important for you.
I believe that this is a very historical moment in our country. This is something that's going to be put in the history books. I believe that. And I wanted them to be firsthand witness along with me by my side.
All 3 boys, and at one point we saw you were crying here.
Yes, I was, deeply. My heart was shattered.
Because you've been following this from the very beginning.
I have been there from the first rally to the first march. The first time I heard about it, it broke my heart, and I've never stopped.
And we saw you had a necklace in memory of Trayvon Martin, you say.
Yeah, it says, in loving memory of Trayvon Martin, you will never be forgotten, and rest in peace, baby boy.
All right, Melinda, thank you so much, and your kids here learning a lesson, of course, in law and
Yes.
and the process.
Yes.
All right, Melinda, thank you so much. David, back to you.
Gio, our thanks to you. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst now and one of the co-anchors of Nightline, Dan Abrams, who's also been following this trial with me every step of the way. Dan, this jury made up of entirely women jurors. 5 of the 6 were actually mothers themselves. And you make it very clear the legal bar they had to look at. Not George Zimmerman necessarily, the person sitting across from them, but there was a legal bar.
That's right. We don't know right now what these jurors think about George Zimmerman. We don't know if they believe George Zimmerman's account of what happened that night. Remember, his account is that Trayvon Martin attacked him. We don't know what they thought about that. Here's what we do know. We do know that they had reasonable doubt in this case. And what does that mean? The heart of the defense was self-defense. George Zimmerman basically saying that in that moment that Trayvon Martin was shot, he reasonably believed that great bodily injury was about to be inflicted on him. Bottom line is, George Zimmerman's team argued he was on the bottom, Trayvon Martin was beating him, and at the moment that he shot him, that it was at that very moment that he reasonably believed that great bodily injury would be inflicted on him. We don't know if the jurors believed it. We do know that they had reasonable doubt, at the very least. I'll be very interested to hear from them as to exactly what they thought about it.
But so much of this case was made of that 911 call, the screams on the tape, the 14 screams, and who the juror would believe ultimately was behind those screams. And also the 911 operator who said, are you following him? We don't need you to do that. Does that factor into this, or does it come down to whether or not they thought at that particular moment George Zimmerman feared for his life?
The prosecution tried to make this about who initiated the altercation. The prosecution argued that it was clear that Trayvon Martin was stalked by George Zimmerman. Zimmerman's team completely disputes that notion. But as a legal matter, that may not even matter. As a legal matter, the most important question, and maybe the only question, is what happened at that very moment when George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin. What was going on in George Zimmerman's mind? Would that be considered self-defense, and at the least, was it reasonable doubt? Because that's the big question. These jurors, at the very least, had reasonable doubt about self-defense.
Which is why it's going to be fascinating, Dan, to hear what these jurors have to say about the family of Trayvon Martin and, of course, about George Zimmerman. In the meantime, we knew of that question late in the day. They'd been deliberating all day today. They asked the judge for instructions again on manslaughter, which, of course, was just beneath second-degree murder. The judge responded and said, you need to be more specific than that with your question, and then they never followed up with a question.
Well, as you and I talked about when that question came out, I thought that should make the defense team nervous. Why? Because it meant that at the very least they were very seriously considering manslaughter. And as a technical legal matter, I have always believed that this is a very tough case for prosecutors. The minute I heard these jurors are seriously considering manslaughter, I thought, whoa, this defense team's got to be concerned about that. In retrospect, we now see the jurors never even got back to the judge. The judge said be more specific. The jurors never even got back to the judge. So I think that we can really deduce from that there was one juror, likely, who had a question, who wanted something resolved, but that by the time the judge asked them the question, the jurors had really worked it out amongst themselves without even needing to go back to the court with a specific answer as to what they were looking for.
Our Chief Legal Affairs anchor, Dan Abrams, and co-anchor of Nightline. Dan, thanks for being here with me. And as we continue here, we want to know what you believe at home. Did you agree with the jury's verdict? We're on Twitter throughout the evening. Let us know. Use the hashtag ABC2020. And when we come back here tonight, we're going to put you in the jury box. We'll show you exactly what they saw and heard in that courtroom for 3 weeks. Stay with us.
2020 continues with the George Zimmerman trial verdict. Once again, David Muir.
Of course, we'll have to wait and find out from those 6 women on the jury about what made up their minds for the verdict they delivered. But how would you have interpreted the evidence? Those 14 screams in that 40 minutes. With George Zimmerman deciding not to take the stand, all we had was 2 teams of impassioned lawyers battling it out. The defense on behalf of the Zimmerman family and Trayvon Martin's family with those prosecutors. Here's a look tonight at how they did it. Once again, Matt Gutman.
Your verdict finding George Zimmerman either guilty or not guilty must be unanimous.
The jury's long-awaited decision came after a tense 3-week trial filled with courtroom fireworks.
He automatically assumed that Trayvon Martin was a criminal.
The impossibly long hours
and short tempers.
I'm not physically able to keep up this pace.
And even the judge storming out on legal teams. Finally, an answer to the burning question: why did George Zimmerman kill Trayvon Martin? Was it murder, manslaughter, or self-defense? The tale of how Martin and Zimmerman's paths fatally collided started here in Sanford, Florida, a small bedroom community on the fringe of the world's happiest city, Orlando. But it's a long way from the theme park crowds on a raw February night inside this gated Sanford community.
This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something.
That's the voice of George Zimmerman, and the guy he's talking about is Trayvon Martin, earlier seen buying an Arizona drink and Skittles at a 7-Eleven. Martin was heading back to his father's fiance's home in the housing complex, where he was spending a 10-day school suspension after getting busted on a pot-related offense, something the jurors never heard. Despite his youthful indiscretions, his family says Martin was just a normal teenage kid into girls, rap music, and airplanes.
He was interested in flying planes. That fascinated him, which led him to go to a program to, try to pursue his career in aviation.
Is there one thing that you miss most about him?
I miss his smile. He was a very affectionate teenager, so I just miss him smiling and giving me a hug.
It's raining, and he's just walking around looking about.
Initially, Martin didn't know he was being tailed by Zimmerman, the self-appointed neighborhood watch captain. By day, an auditor. By night, Zimmerman, who had a past interest in law enforcement, kept a wary eye out on behalf of his neighbors.
What was your first impression of Zimmerman?
I thought he was meek and easygoing, and at first I had a little trepidation that this guy was going to be running a neighborhood watch.
How do you think he did as a neighborhood watchman?
Fantastic. His efforts and his diligence yielded results.
And that firearm.
But in court, prosecutors painted Zimmerman as an overzealous wannabe cop. His language in this non-emergency call to police helped spark the racial debate over the case.
He's got his hand in his waistband. And he's a black male.
And fueled allegations that he was aggressively profiling a harmless teenage student.
Just let me know if this guy does anything else. Okay. They always get away.
Punks. These they always get away. Those were the words in that grown man's mouth as he followed in the dark a 17-year-old boy.
The prosecution wants to make it clear that he already had a mindset when he got out of his car and began to follow Trayvon Martin.
Armed with a fully loaded semi-automatic pistol.
Prosecutors argue that Zimmerman was hell-bent on stalking Martin, even when told by police to call it off.
Are you following him? Yeah. Okay, we don't need you to do that. Okay.
And then Zimmerman hangs up. At that point, Martin is on the last phone call of his life with his friend, Rachel Chantel, and he's racked with worry about the strange man shadowing him.
You just told him the man looked creepy. And
he said the man looked creepy.
Creepy white.
Okay.
Excuse my language, cracker.
Chantel says she told Martin to run away, but then she says she heard him being confronted by Zimmerman.
Why are you following me for? And then I heard a hard breath man come and say, what you doing around here? And then I started hearing a little bit of Trayvon saying, get off, get off.
This is the path where the lives of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman collided that night. And out here for about 30 or 40 seconds, there was a black hole of information until dispatchers from 911 started getting flooded by calls from neighbors all around.
They're wrestling right in the back of my porch.
Someone's yelling 2 doors down from me, screaming, hollering, help, help, help.
Then a gunshot that shatters the night.
Oh my God, it's someone to be shot.
Oh my God. And there's a black guy down that looks like he's been shot and he's dead.
George Zimmerman did not shoot Trayvon Martin because he had to. He shot him for the worst of all reasons. Because he wanted to.
He said, yo, you got a problem?
But in this police reenactment, Zimmerman says it was he who was confronted by an angry Trayvon Martin.
And he said, you got a problem now. And then he was here, and he punched me in the face. He got on top of me somewhere around here. That's when I started screaming for help. I started screaming, help, help, as loud as I could. I tried to sit up, and that's when he grabbed me by the head and tried to slam my head down.
Zimmerman says the confrontation escalated after Martin spotted the gun on his hip.
He looked at it and he said, "You're gonna die tonight, motherfucker." And he reached for it, but he reached, like I felt his arm going down to my side, and I grabbed it, and I just grabbed my firearm and I shot him one time.
After you shot him, what did he say?
After I shot him, he like sat up and he said, "Oh, you got me."
About 2 minutes after the shot rang out, this photo was taken at the scene. The defense says it confirms Zimmerman's account that he was attacked by Martin. And in court, even a neighbor called as a prosecution witness appeared to back up Zimmerman's account that he was the one being attacked.
I could tell the person on the bottom had a lighter skinned color.
The jury has been presented with two completely contradictory accounts of what happened, with no solid evidence to back up either side's claims. That is, until a critical piece of evidence is introduced.
I'm gonna play the whole thing.
A 911 call where a voice is heard screaming for help.
There's just someone screaming outside. Do you think he's yelling help? Yes.
14 screams in 40 seconds. The critical question, does that desperate voice belong to Trayvon Martin or George Zimmerman?
If it was George Zimmerman screaming out for help, then it supports his theory that he acted in self-defense.
I thought it was George.
To identify the voice, the defense calls a parade of Zimmerman's friends, who perhaps not surprisingly say it's him on the tape.
Do you know whose voice that is in the background screaming?
Yes, definitely. It's Georgie. I hear it. I hear him screaming.
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that is George Zimmerman.
The mothers of both Martin and Zimmerman also take the stand, and they confidently identify the voice as that of their son.
Who do you recognize that to be, man?
Trayvon Benjamin Martin. I'm sure that's George's voice.
Defense would call Tracy Martin, Your Honor.
But then the defense calls a more unlikely witness.
And nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Trayvon Martin's father, Tracy Martin. Police say Martin informed them just 2 days after the shooting that he did not believe the voice on the tape was his son's. But on the stand, Martin seems to change his story, saying that after hearing the tape over 20 times, he's now convinced it was his son crying for help.
I was listening to my son's last cry for help. I was listening to his life being taken, and I was coming to grips that Trayvon was here no more.
I think at the end of the day, the testimony of these witnesses will cancel themselves out. The jurors are going to have to listen to that 911 tape, and they're going to have to decide for themselves who they believe that voice is.
And the only person who knows exactly what happened that night,
The defendant, George Zimmerman,
decided not to testify in his own defense.
After consulting with counsel, not to testify, Your Honor.
But the testimony of this woman, the so-called star witness, had everyone talking.
A lot of people criticized her for her hair, for her skin, for her darker skin tone.
And her answers raised an ugly taboo.
Justice for Trayvon!
Race.
We can't get justice for a young black boy!
To say this case is not about race is ignoring the pink elephant in the room.
Stay with us. No justice, no peace. Some of the signs outside that Sanford, Florida courtroom at this hour. You're watching a special edition of 2020. George Zimmerman found not guilty in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And this tweet moments ago from Trayvon Martin's mother. Lord, during my darkest hour, I lean on you. You are all that I have. At the end of the day, God is still in control. Thank you all for your prayers and support. I will love you forever, Trayvon, in the name of Jesus. The phrase racial profiling was not used in court, but it did come up for so many people across this country who watched the trial so closely. So did race play a role in what happened that night? Once again tonight, Matt Gutman. Rachel Jeantel was the state's star witness. She was supposed to spellbind the jury with details of her phone call with Trayvon Martin just moments before he was killed. Then she opened her mouth.
That's real retarded, sir. That's real retarded to do that, sir.
19 years old and just entering her senior year, Jeantel was pitted against savvy trial lawyers who kept her floundering on the witness stand for 7 hours.
Are you claiming in any way that you don't understand English?
I understand you. I understand you. I do understand English.
This was the moment that people were waiting for, to hear this star witness, if you will, and it turned out to be something very, very different. It ended up not being about Trayvon and ended up being more about her.
Jantel was not only vilified, this professor says she was mammified.
Tell me what you mean by the mammification of Rachel Jantel.
A lot of people came out and criticized her for her hair, for her dark skin, her darker skin tone, for being overweight.
And when she thought she was out, they brought her back in.
I think we should plan on at least a couple of hours.
What?
Excuse me, be quiet.
Most of what Jantel was supposed to say got lost in how she said it.
At that point, did you know anything more about the case?
No.
Race surfaced again when Jantel said Martin referred to George Zimmerman as a
creepy ass cracker.
Please sit down.
The defense team jumped on that, suggesting it was Martin who had done the profiling. With Jantel, race, a sideshow before, became the main attraction.
To say this case is not about race is ignoring the pink elephant in the room. This case is about race.
Shortly after the bullet left Zimmerman's gun, race became the flashpoint, but the wheels of justice in Sanford were turning at glacial speed.
We want arrest! Shot in the chest!
There was no arrest for 6 weeks.
No justice! No peace!
It divided Sanford and a nation.
If a black man had come into a white neighborhood and gunned down a 17-year-old boy, all hell would let loose.
Celebrities and average Joes alike pulled on the kind of hoodies Martin wore that night. It inspired the Million Hoodie March, 1,000 miles away from Sanford, high school walkouts, and so many protests. The message was being heard all the way to the White House.
You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon.
Knowing what I know today, if I were a DA, I would not have touched this case.
Christopher Darden, famous for prosecuting O.J. Simpson, knows firsthand how race can influence a murder trial.
Do you think that the issue of race could actually affect the way the jurors decide the verdict?
People say all the time, all around, everywhere I go, you know, if he wasn't black, he wouldn't have followed him. If he wasn't black, he wouldn't have gotten out of his vehicle. If he wasn't black, he wouldn't have confronted him.
Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic? He looks black.
Zimmerman was only responding to a direct question from the police dispatcher, but those 3 words stung many.
Gracious God, our Heavenly Father, we lift up this case to you because you, Father God, know exactly what happened that night.
Here at the AME Allen Church in Sanford, churchgoers say publicly what many feel privately.
I can assure you unequivocally, if I, being a black man, had killed a 17-year-old white boy under the conditions that that boy was murdered, I've been in jail, probably doing time now. You know, I'm just calling it like it is.
About a third of Sanford's 54,000 residents are black. As the trial gripped their community, some church members began speaking out about an unholy topic.
Until we become honest about the divide that exists in this community, there will be no getting better.
Still, this little church dreamed big, the laundry list of prayers to be answered.
First thing we asked for was the arrest. Then we asked for the chief of police to be fired, and we did get an African-American black chief. That was our heart's desire.
Divine intervention? Perhaps, but it was the city manager's intervention that fired the old police chief and hired Cecil Smith.
Think you were hired because you're African American?
I think I was hired for my qualifications.
Smith will attempt to play top cop, mediator, and peacemaker all at the same time.
There's been essentially a separation between the two races for quite some time. And our goal right now, at least for police chief, is to try to bridge that gap.
In closing arguments and speaking to the all-female jury, all but one of whom are white, prosecutor Bernie Della Rianda invoked Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech as he tried to do damage control on Rachel Jantel's testimony.
I had a dream that today a witness would be judged not on the color of her personality, but on the content of her testimony.
George Zimmerman, the man charged with second-degree murder of
Folks in Sanford are well aware the nation is watching.
It turned out to a big week in the George Zimmerman trial.
The trial broadcast wall-to-wall on TV.
Is it a race case? Yes, because we've all interjected race into it. Those civil rights activists and the media. You helped to make this a race case.
At the most racially charged trial in memory, TV cameras have also spotted Shauna Lloyd. This 34-year-old African-American law student works for the defense as a law clerk, which means by extension, she works for George Zimmerman. The jaded will say she is nothing more than a legal prop.
You sit there every day, you look at George Zimmerman sitting right next to you. How do you feel about him?
I feel bad for George. I think it's very unfortunate that Trayvon Martin lost his life, because loss of life is always unfortunate. But I think that George is also fighting for a life that probably will never be the same, but it's still his.
Do you think of George Zimmerman as a topic differently than you think of George Zimmerman the person?
Absolutely.
Have other people asked you about her?
Yeah, someone have asked, is she there because of her race? And, the answer is pretty easy, no.
Another example of the case that's all about race, despite the word rarely mentioned in court.
Racism has been the elephant in the room in the trial, but never overtly mentioned.
It's the sort of ultimate personification of how race plays itself out in our society today. You don't really know.
And you can't really put your finger on it.
But you feel it, right? If you're on the receiving end of that, you feel it.
Are you claiming in any way that you don't understand English?
Even before the verdict was read, it was all hands on deck.
What percentage of your police force is going to be ready in anticipation of whatever happens?
Our entire police department.
Everybody.
There's no vacations, there's no furloughs.
Just yesterday, the family of George Zimmerman released a statement saying the judicial system has run its course. Pray for justice, pray for peace, pray for our country.
Next, the city of Sanford, gripped by fear. Death threats, anonymous phone calls, and their mayor, whose family is a target.
He looks absolutely terrified.
Chaos and casualties, even before the verdict. Coming up.
More than 2 weeks of testimony, 56 witnesses, hundreds of pieces of evidence. But only one man knows exactly what happened the night Trayvon Martin was killed. And Friday, in closing arguments, his lawyer called him a victim.
There was some anger and hostility and ill will and spite maybe that night. It just had nothing to do with George Zimmerman. Well, that's not true. It had something to do with George Zimmerman. He was the victim of it.
Defense attorney Mark O'Mara implored the jury not to assume anything or make snap judgments and laid the burden of proof squarely at the feet of the prosecution.
Give me a shred of evidence that contradicts that he had any other option.
Sabrina Fulton couldn't take it, leaving the courtroom as pictures of her dead son played one last time for the jury. 6 women, 5 of them mothers.
Isn't that every child's worst nightmare? To be followed on the way home in the dark?
And lawyers for the state of Florida tried to depict George Zimmerman as a man who had choices and made a deadly one.
Trayvon Martin may not have the defendant's blood on his hands, but George Zimmerman will forever have Trayvon Martin's blood on his.
2 lives forever changed.
Your verdict is not going to bring Trayvon Benjamin Martin back to life. Your verdict is not going to change the past, but it will forever define it.
And as the nation is about to turn its attention away from this tiny community, one person is left to pick up the pieces.
A guy lost his life. Another guy shot him. When you pull that trigger, no matter what's going on, your life has changed. Whether you go to jail or don't go to jail, your life is totally, totally different.
Sanford Mayor Jeff Triplett says there's no going back. Still, he's preserved every moment of this tragedy.
I mean, this is really like a little sliver of history.
It's a scrapbook of a city turned upside down. Faded clippings of memories still fresh.
Son looks terrified there.
He looks absolutely terrified as to what's happening.
Shot in the chest. We want arrest.
the innocence of the children watching all this and trying to understand what's going on.
Here in Sanford, being mayor is only a part-time job, but keeping the city safe amid nasty emails, anonymous phone calls, even death threats became a full-time occupation.
It was a lot of pressure, and I don't care if you're the mayor of New York City or the mayor of Sanford, Florida. There's no way you can truly be prepared for it.
Whereas Trayvon Martin lost his life, others lost their livelihoods. Police Chief Bill Lee, a 30-year veteran, was fired.
He's a good man. For me, it wasn't what the investigation was. It was the handling afterwards, the chaos management, so to speak.
He didn't take the candy, he took the life and left the child.
Lee is shouted down during a press conference weeks after the shooting. He marches away as I try to talk to him. I understand your frustration, but
I thought for the good of the community, and particularly for the good of the Sanford Police Department, we needed to move forward.
But Lee wasn't the only cop casualty. Once a star detective, lead homicide investigator Chris Serino was banished to the graveyard shift, night patrol. On day 6 of the trial, Serino was called by the prosecution, but ironically ended up helping the defense, saying George Zimmerman was believable.
His statement, what did that indicate to you?
Either he was telling the truth, or he was a complete pathological liar, one of the two.
Okay.
And then there's the police department spokesman, David Morgenstern, silenced as well.
Morgenstern, the PIO,
Morgenstern's still sergeant on the police department.
but no longer the public information officer.
No, he is right now on workers' comp, so he's on light duty.
Okay.
But the public remains rattled, especially in the sleepy development where neighbors are still defending George Zimmerman.
Matt, he had these.
He may have fought, but he has just the same right for self-defense as George Zimmerman did.
He had these, okay?
You'll never convince Frank Taffy that George Zimmerman did anything wrong that night.
16 months ago, you'd never been on TV. Now you're on TV 3 times a day.
Everybody has 15 minutes of fame. Mine's on a loop, Matt.
But fame has had its price, especially for those who never asked for it.
You have Jonathan Good that actually saw the fight. You have Jeremy and Jenna who made the 911 calls. You got the Manolos. You got Selma. You have Celine. You have Serdaika. All these people are casualties of this tragedy.
Lives destroyed, careers ended, a city ripped apart by the greatest casualty of all, the death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Jeff Triplett, the mayor, now more of a custodian, trying to piece a broken city back together.
You apologize and you try to make things better. You know, that's all you can do is try to. You can't change the past. You cannot change it, but by God, you can walk through it and try to make it better.
Such divisions on both sides of this case, and in fact, at this hour from the Sanford Police Department, one of the investigators for the police department saying it's very quiet. We have people patrolling right now, nothing different than usual, nothing out of the ordinary. Encouraging from Sanford, Florida. When we come back on 2020, what the jury didn't get to hear, would it have made a difference in their verdict? We want you to hear it. You decide when we come back.
2020 continues with the George Zimmerman trial verdict. Once again, David Muir.
So what wasn't the jury allowed to hear over the course of the 3-week trial? Possible skeletons from the closets of both George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin? And would those details, not permitted in court, have changed the jury's verdict? Once again tonight, Matt Gutman.
For more than 15 days, this is what the jury saw. Theatrics. Fits of anger.
It's outrageous that the state would seek to do this at this time. Knock, knock. Who's there?
Even bad humor.
George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman. Who? All right, good. You're on the jury.
But what didn't those 6 female jurors hear, and why?
The judge excluded a number of negative personal items about Trayvon Martin.
For a year, the defense team desperately wanted the jury to see what it called 17-year-old Trayvon Martin's checkered past, like those 3 school suspensions, including one for having been caught with traces of pot. and another for allegedly having burglary tools in his backpack. There's this video. Martin shot himself, the only available sample of his voice, laughing as homeless men fight over a bike. Then there are these photos from his cell phone, Martin giving the finger, marijuana plants, blowing smoke. But the judge said, no dice.
The only reason to introduce that picture would have been to smear Trayvon Martin, and that's not what this case is about.
What is the most important piece of evidence you think they didn't hear?
Well, I think that they had the right to hear about Trayvon Martin's past that was shown as far as him fighting.
Zimmerman's defense attorney, Mark O'Mara, is talking about text messages in which Martin boasts he could knock a man down with a single punch. I lost the first round but won the second and third, he wrote. I'm not done with this fool. He's gonna have to see me again. But Zimmerman had skeletons in his closet, too. Eventually, prosecutors would lose their bid to introduce a prior accusation of domestic violence. And then there's a 2005 arrest for allegedly assaulting a police officer. That charge was ultimately dropped. And remember that explosive 911 call with those blood-curdling screams?
So you think he's yelling help? Yes. All right, what is your phone number?
So much was made of that 911 call. The screams. Who was screaming? Why was that so important?
Well, I think for both sides, that case was important because I think that if that was a definitive answer, then that would tell us what happened.
But the judge barred the prosecution from calling two audio experts who would have testified they believed those desperate cries for help came from Martin.
The judge ruled that the science was too unreliable. It definitely would have helped prosecutors to have experts, not just family members, but experts who could say, I believe very strongly that that's Trayvon Martin's voice on that tape.
The most contentious arguments away from the jury's view came just this week.
10 o'clock at night, we started this morning.
When the defense, prosecutors, and even the judge
Court is in recess. Thank you very much with all.
Sparred over whether to admit this elaborate 3D animation into evidence. It depicts what Zimmerman says happened moments before he shot and killed Trayvon Martin. She did, however, allow the defense team to reference it during its closing argument. Save for those 2 days of testimony when Rachel Jontel's choice of words was picked apart by the defense, the specter of race was